Human beings are not defined by comfort, but by the courage to break free from what makes them comfortable. Norm is not a book about becoming tougher, but a radical dissection of the silent patterns that bind us under the guise of kindness. Author Robert Glover Rotbaclover leads readers into the hidden corners of the psyche, where a good person can sometimes be the most afraid of conflict, hesitant about their own true needs, and secretly harbor unspoken resentments. But if one day you realize that every effort to be liked has caused you to lose yourself, will you have the courage to shed the mask you've worn for so long? And when that void is revealed, what will you fill it with? We encourage listeners to buy and read the book to fully grasp its content. Only by reading the entire book will you truly understand the issues I'm about to discuss. For now, let's begin summarizing this book. Chapter 1, The Nice Guy Syndrome. I want you to imagine a man walking into a room with a gentle smile, his gaze avoiding prolonged eye contact. In every word he utters, there's a single hidden desire: to please everyone. He doesn't yell, doesn't cause trouble, is always willing to yield, and seems perpetually charming. But beneath that polite facade lies an undercurrent of frustration, resentment, and a feeling of being overlooked. This is the world of the nice guy men programmed to believe that if they are good, avoid conflict, and please everyone, they will be loved and everything good will come their way. I used to be a nice guy in every sense of the word. I understand the constant feeling of trying to be the right version of myself in other people's eyes. From avoiding making my girlfriend angry, striving to satisfy my boss, to nodding along with unreasonable requests just to avoid offending anyone. This cycle, though seemingly harmless, is in reality a gilded cage. On the outside, everyone thinks you're fine, but on the inside, you're exhausted from constantly performing, from hiding the imperfect parts of yourself. This syndrome doesn't form overnight. It's nurtured by early family experiences, where a child learns that love, safety, or recognition depends on how good they are. Many nice guys grow up in environments with busy, distant, or strict parents, where expressing true needs or feelings is often seen as selfish or troublesome. So, to be loved, the child learns to please others and bury their sadness, anger, and dissatisfaction deep inside. But the price of always being nice is losing your authentic self. You avoid conflict at all costs, even when conflict is necessary to set boundaries. You agree to things your heart doesn't want, then silently resent it. You expect your kindness to be reciprocated with love, respect, or even special privileges. And when that doesn't happen, you feel betrayed, feeling the world is unfair. Ironically, nice guys often think they are different from bad men, those who are selfish, violent, or treacherous. They tell themselves, "I'm not like them, I'm kind, I care." But this very belief traps them in a dangerous snare, using kindness as a manipulative strategy. Though they themselves don't realize it, their good deeds and sacrifices are sometimes not pure, but hide a desire to control outcomes, wanting others to respond exactly as they expect. And when life doesn't follow the script, that kindness turns bitter. Another characteristic of this syndrome is the tendency to hide anything that might displease others. A nice guy will avoid expressing his true sexual desires, shy away from admitting he's angry or dissatisfied. Instead, he finds indirect ways to meet his needs and often fails. He becomes a master at adjusting himself to fit others' expectations, but clumsy at living authentically. These men also often take on the responsibility of making everything all right. From maintaining family harmony to covering up others' problems, they believe that if they control enough, worry enough, help enough, chaos will be avoided and they will be loved. But in reality, this exhausts them and sometimes leads to them being exploited. The nice guy syndrome doesn't just affect the man, it impacts those around him. Relationships become vague, lacking transparency. Partners may feel constrained or suspicious because they sense that the kindness isn't entirely unconditional. Friends or colleagues may not know where the limits are because the nice guy rarely sets clear boundaries. The problem isn't kindness itself, but that kindness is used as a shield and a bargaining tool. Instead of stemming from freedom and sincerity, it's tied to the fear of loss, the fear of rejection. And until this motivation is seen through, the nice guy will remain stuck in a loop, wanting to be loved yet afraid to live authentically. One of the biggest paradoxes of this syndrome is that it makes a man less trustworthy, not more. It sounds illogical. How can someone who constantly tries to be kind be seen as insincere? But when you continuously hide your true self, others sense an invisible distance. They're unsure what you're thinking, feeling, or wanting. They only see a perpetually pleasant mask, but behind it, you're unpredictable. This creates ambiguity and sometimes insecurity in relationships. Nice guys often skillfully avoid conflict instead of directly saying, "I disagree," or "I don't want to do this." They choose silence or indirect routes. They might even emotionally disappear, retreating into work, hobbies, or personal activities to avoid confrontation. They view conflict as a threat rather than a natural part of healthy communication. But avoidance doesn't make problems disappear. It only simmers and accumulates over time. These repressed emotions find ways to escape, often in the form of passive aggression, sarcasm, or even sudden outbursts. A nice guy might do everything to maintain a pleasant image, then one day lose his temper over a tiny matter with an outsider. This appears to be an inexplicable loss of control, but it's actually the result of months, even years, of suppression. Nice guys also tend to seek validation as their primary source of nourishment. They measure their self-worth by what others think, say, or how they treat them. This makes them sensitive to rejection or criticism. A gentle reproach can trigger the fear of abandonment, of being undervalued. To avoid this, they try even harder to be good, to conform more, and the spiral continues. The author clearly describes that nice guys are not always gentle in the traditional sense. Some may be very successful in their careers, confident in certain areas, but when it comes to their romantic lives or close relationships, they immediately fall into their familiar role, the accommodating, patient man who avoids conflict. In public, they can be strong and decisive. At home, they become the compromiser in everything, even when it makes them miserable. From their own perspective, this strategy seems logical. If I make others happy, I will be happy. But in reality, this creates imbalanced relationships. Partners or friends don't truly know what they want and sometimes feel burdened by having to guess their feelings or be responsible for the nice guy's happiness. Notably, many nice guys grow up with a weak or absent father figure or an overly strong, controlling mother. They learn to adjust their behavior to maintain peace, but simultaneously lose the ability to define their own boundaries as adults. They carry this pattern into every relationship, especially with women. Some even seek relationships with controlling women because they unconsciously became accustomed to this power dynamic in childhood. Another characteristic is that they often feel responsible for fixing or saving others. They believe that if they help enough, they will be loved or recognized. But sometimes this help becomes over-intervention, making the other person feel controlled or lose their freedom. On a deeper level, this is a form of transaction. I'll give you what you need, and in return, you'll give me what I want. Though they rarely admit this, even to themselves. And because they always avoid unpleasant truths, nice guys rarely confront the core fear that they are not good enough to be loved for who they truly are. This is the root cause of their continuous self-modification, concealment, and striving. They fear that if others see all their flaws, love and acceptance will vanish. And living in this fear, they are never truly loved completely because others only love the image they project, not the real person. The most dangerous aspect of this lifestyle is that it's often praised. When I always acted kind, pleasant, yielded, and was ready to help, people around me would nod and say I was a good man. And it was these compliments that once made me believe I was on the right path. But the truth is, I didn't feel free. I still yearned for something deeper, to be loved and accepted completely for who I am, without needing to wear a charming face to be allowed to stay. When all my actions revolved around seeking acceptance, I turned myself into someone dependent on the gaze and reactions of others. And paradoxically, this diminished my attractiveness. People are drawn to those who exude inner strength and integrity, not those who live in fear of rejection. The more I tried to please, the more I was overlooked, taken for granted. I also saw how this way of living made my sex life empty. Afraid of rejection, I didn't dare to explicitly state what I wanted. I thought that if I was good enough, the other person would naturally respond. But that silence only led to frustration. At times, I sought satisfaction outside my main relationship, then plunged into guilt. all just to feed a familiar narrative: I'm not good enough. Then I realized that to escape this trap, I had to look directly at it. I had to stop blaming circumstances or others and start dismantling the beliefs that had bound me for so many years. That simply behaving correctly would bring me everything I wanted, that conflict must be avoided at all costs, that I must always be pleasant to be loved. I understood that giving up the nice guy role doesn't mean becoming selfish or rude. What I aimed for was a way of living based on authenticity and self-respect, not on fear. I learned to be kind without strings attached, to love without bargaining, to help without expecting anything in return. The deepest change was accepting my imperfect parts: anger, personal needs, limitations, and even mistakes. All of them are me. Only by letting others see all these parts did I open myself to the opportunity for deep and lasting love. It's like being in a beautifully decorated house with a rotten foundation. To rebuild, I had to strip away each layer of decor and reinforce the core. It was hard work, requiring courage and patience. But the reward was a life that was truly mine, not a role played to buy the acceptance of others. And when I stood before the mirror, I no longer adjusted my gaze or smiled to please anyone. I looked at the person there and knew I was beginning to rewrite the story. The story where I live authentically and am loved for it. Asterisk Chapter 2. The Making of a Nice Guy asterisk asterisk. I once believed that I chose this way of living, that becoming a man who accommodates, maintains harmony, and avoids trouble was a conscious decision I made as an adult. But the deeper I delved into the question of why I was this way, the more I realized the truth wasn't so simple. I didn't just wake up one morning and decide to be a nice guy. I was shaped into one, little by little, from early childhood. A child isn't born with a ready-made set of rules. They learn how to exist from their surrounding environment. And my first environment, my family, was where everything was molded. From the glances, voices, silences, or anger of my parents, I learned lessons about what was acceptable and what needed to be hidden. I quickly learned that certain parts of me, if revealed, would cause trouble, and I also learned that certain behaviors, if displayed, would bring love or at least temporary peace. That's when I started building the first wall, a wall built with skill but driven by fear. I avoided anything that might provoke adult disappointment. I learned to smile when I didn't want to, say yes when I wanted to say no, and retreat when my instincts urged me forward. In a child's mind, this wasn't dishonesty, it was survival. Many nice guys grew up in homes filled with tension, parental conflict, cold silence, or harsh rules that were never explained. Sometimes it was physical violence, sometimes emotional violence, knife-sharp words, gestures that made you feel insignificant. But sometimes it was just absence, a lack of affirmation, a lack of hugs, a lack of feeling seen and heard. As children, we couldn't say, "Mom and Dad are wrong," or "This environment isn't good." Instead, we thought something was wrong with us. To fix that wrong, I began refining myself like a meticulous craftsman polishing a rough stone. I trimmed away the edges I thought would displease others and polished the surfaces I believed would make them happy. I became an optimized version of myself, designed to avoid criticism, to earn a bit of warmth. I also observed a common thread among many other nice guys. We grew up with vague or unstable male role models, perhaps an absent father, or one who was present but cold, or too weak to protect his own boundaries. Sometimes it was a hot-tempered, unpredictable father who kept us constantly guessing his mood to avoid disaster. And when we couldn't find security from male role models, we turned to women mothers, grandmothers, sisters, unconsciously learning how to live in a way that would gain their acceptance. I remember once accidentally upsetting my mother with a thoughtless answer. Her reaction, the prolonged silence and disappointed look, made me feel as if I had shattered the entire world. From then on, I learned to measure every word, weigh every gesture, never to see that look again. As a child, this seemed like a logical solution, but as I grew, it became an ingrained way of life. I self-censored everything before expressing it, just to avoid the possibility of creating any crack in a relationship. My childhood wasn't a continuous string of tragedies. There were still warm moments, times of praise, occasions when the family laughed together. It was these sweet fragments that made me believe I just needed to try a little harder, and everything would always be good. So I clung to this strategy, making it the foundation of my life. If I was good enough, pleasant enough, I would be loved. but the cost was cutting off important parts of myself. I learned to hide my true feelings, especially anger, frustration, and personal needs. I taught myself that those emotions were dangerous, that they would make me lose affection or ignite conflict. I didn't know that each time I suppressed them, I was adding another brick to the wall separating me from others and from myself. As I got older, I began to extend this life strategy beyond the family. At school, I tried to be the well-behaved student praised by teachers. I learned to anticipate my friends' wishes to fit in, to avoid conflict. If there was a disagreement, I would back down, even if it meant silently swallowing my resentment. I thought this would keep me safe and accepted, but in reality, I was training myself in the habit of disappearing whenever there was a risk of displeasing someone. The outside world also reinforced this false belief. Society praised those who sacrificed, were patient, polite. The movies and stories I encountered depicted the ideal man as someone who always prioritized others, was always patient, and rarely spoke of his own needs. I didn't realize that behind those stories often lay a different reality. Excessive sacrifice leads to resentment, prolonged silence leads to distance, and long-term self-neglect leads to a loss of one's very being. No matter how hard I tried, some people still didn't like me. I could exhaust myself helping, yielding, compromising, and still receive indifference or criticism. But instead of questioning my life strategy, I concluded that I wasn't good enough, not kind enough. This only made me redouble my efforts, clinging tighter to the role of the nice man. There were moments when I felt angry, wanted to explode, wanted to say that I also had limits. But immediately, a familiar voice echoed in my head, "Don't do it, they'll leave you, you'll lose everything." So I swallowed it. Each time, I felt a part of myself disappear, as if I was whittling myself down until I no longer had my own shape. In early romantic relationships, this pattern became even clearer. I became such a good boyfriend that I lost myself. I yielded in almost every decision, from where to go, what to eat, whom to meet, even suppressing my true feelings to avoid causing discomfort. At first, this made me seem pleasant and kind. But over time, the lack of personality and boundaries made the relationship bland and imbalanced. I didn't understand why I was being left, especially when I had done everything right. Looking back, I see that my life strategy was actually a sophisticated defense system. It helped me avoid confronting the fear of rejection, abandonment, and hurt, but it also simultaneously prevented me from touching true intimacy. Because to be intimate, you must dare to let others see your vulnerable, messy, and imperfect parts. I, on the other hand, only showed them the processed, polished, and safe version. It was the fear of being hurt that made me live a life where I never truly connected with anyone. I was too busy protecting myself to realize that the walls I built were also walls that imprisoned me. And each time I thought about tearing them down, I remembered my childhood, where any flaw could lead to a loss of affection. And I recoiled. Sometimes an honest conversation, however risky, brought a sense of closeness I had never known. Sometimes saying, "No," helped me feel more confident and self-respecting. These experiences were like rays of light piercing through the cracks of a dark room, reminding me that there was a world beyond fear. A world where I could live without constantly modifying myself to please others. Who is happy? Who is annoyed? What could cause a conflict to erupt? Then I adjust my behavior accordingly, like an antenna constantly scanning others' emotional frequencies. This was once an excellent survival skill when I had no power or voice in my family, but as an adult, it became a burden. I lived too much in the minds of others, neglecting my own inner life. The problem is, when you're used to living to please others, you lose the ability to know what you truly want. I once sat in a coffee shop. The person opposite asked, "What do you want to drink?" And I felt empty for a few seconds. Not because I hadn't chosen a drink, but because my whole life I was used to prioritizing the answer I thought would please others. I had lost the habit of listening to my own true desires. As I entered deeper relationships with close friends, partners, colleagues, this safe strategy revealed its downsides even more clearly. I believed that the more I did for others, the more they would like me. But in reality, they sometimes felt stifled, or worse, they realized that my kindness was conditional. Because behind every good deed was an expectation of reciprocation, not with money or gifts, but with attention, affection, or at least recognition. And when I didn't receive it, I fell into a state of silent disappointment and anger. While I tried to avoid conflict, this way of living created conflict in a different way. The things I didn't say, for fear of hurting someone, accumulated into simmering resentment. Then, at some point, it would erupt into inexplicable outbursts of anger towards others. They were surprised, even frightened, not knowing how long I had endured. And after each such incident, I would blame myself even more and promise to be better so it wouldn't happen again. The loop continued endlessly. The deep root of it all still goes back to childhood. Early experiences taught me that love was conditional. I would be accepted if I met others' expectations, and I would be withdrawn from if I revealed my unpleasant parts. From then on, I tied my happiness to controlling others' reactions, an impossible task. But I persisted as if it were a matter of survival. The turning point came when I realized I was living like an actor, changing costumes and lines every day depending on the audience in front of me. I no longer knew which was the real role, which was the mask. And the question began to echo: if I stripped away every layer, who would still remain? That question was both terrifying and liberating, because it showed me the problem wasn't that I wasn't good enough to be loved, but that I had never given anyone the chance to love my true self. Understanding this didn't mean I changed immediately. Habits formed in childhood don't disappear in a moment of enlightenment, but at least I started to try. I tried to say what I wanted, tried to say no when necessary, tried to let others see my imperfections. Each time, I felt a little fear, but also a little relief. The making of a nice guy isn't a story of someone born weak or submissive. It's the story of an intelligent, sensitive child who found the best strategy to survive in his environment. The problem is that strategy, when carried into adulthood, becomes a yoke. And to remove it, I had to confront what I had avoided my entire life: the truth that I also have the right to live for myself, even if it means not everyone will like me. And that's where the journey of liberation begins, not by learning something new, but by dismantling the protective layers that once saved me but are now imprisoning me. Chapter 3. Learning to please the only one who truly matters. From a young age, I learned to gauge the temperature of a room by the expressions on others' faces. If someone frowned, I knew I needed to change my behavior. If they smiled, I felt safe. And for many years, I let others' expressions dictate my feelings. I thought it was cleverness, empathy. Now I understand that it was how I handed the keys to my life to everyone else, except myself. The trap here wasn't just that I lived to please others, but also that I had no idea how to please myself. In my mind, my needs always came last. If I wanted to rest but someone needed my help, I would drop my own tasks to rush to them. If I wanted something but feared it would displease others, I immediately pushed it aside. I realized my whole life was like a 24/7 restaurant, ready to serve anyone who walked in. But ironically, I never sat down to eat my own meal. When I started to break this pattern, I had to confront feelings of guilt. Choosing myself over others once made me feel like I was committing a serious offense. I was used to believing that if I was even a little selfish, everyone would abandon me. But I also realized that precisely because I always neglected myself, I constantly felt empty, exhausted, and sometimes full of resentment. The turning point came when I tried something simple. Instead of asking everyone what they wanted from me, I started asking myself what I truly wanted right now. That question initially sounded selfish, but it was a key I had never tried using. The first time I applied it, I said no to a social invitation simply because I wanted to stay home and read. Surprisingly, no one got angry or blamed me. The world didn't collapse. Pleasing myself doesn't mean ignoring or hurting others. It simply means acknowledging that I am also part of the equation. If I always neglect my needs, all the goodness I give will eventually run out, leaving an exhausted and irritable person. And then, even the people I wanted to please will suffer the consequences. Choosing the meal I wanted instead of asking what others liked and ordering accordingly. Going to bed early even if someone wanted me to stay up talking. Spending time alone without feeling the need to explain. Each time, I discovered a little more power that I had previously handed over to others. But this wasn't a straight path. Sometimes I would slip back into old habits. I would find myself agreeing to do something I didn't want just to maintain harmony. And each time, I had to remind myself that harmony achieved by denying myself is false harmony. It's just a calm surface hiding underlying currents. When I started prioritizing myself, my relationships didn't worsen, they improved. Others began to know who they were truly with. They didn't have to guess if I genuinely wanted something or was just pretending. I also learned that when I was clear about my needs, I gave others the opportunity to meet them willingly, rather than being forced to guess. One of my hardest habits to break was the reflex to check others' eyes and reactions before making a decision, as if I needed an external map to know if I was on the right path. But the problem is that map constantly changes, depending on others' moods, expectations, and even prejudices. Once, during a meeting, I offered a new idea. Immediately, I glanced at the faces around the table to gauge if I had pleased everyone or annoyed them. Just a few seconds later, I realized I was no longer focusing on what I had just said, but guessing their reactions and preparing to refine my next words. I wasn't truly present. I was playing the role of someone seeking consensus rather than someone with something to say. To break this habit, I started focusing on my internal feelings. Each time I made a decision, I asked myself, does this truly reflect who I am? Is it true to my values and needs? Initially, that question confused me because I had never been used to living by an internal compass. I was like a sailor who always navigated by signals from shore, now having to learn to read the stars. The interesting thing is that, when I started to trust myself, I felt more comfortable with others disagreeing. I no longer felt I had to win every argument or make everyone nod in agreement. I understood that disagreement doesn't mean rejecting who I am, it simply means different choices or perspectives. Another deeper change was learning to define and protect my boundaries. Previously, my boundaries were like lines drawn in the sand a gentle wave would erase them. Now, I started setting them like fixed markers. This doesn't mean becoming rigid or closed off, but realizing that limits help me maintain my integrity. The first time I truly defended a boundary was when a friend repeatedly asked me to do things beyond my capacity and time. In the past, I would find a way to manage, even sacrificing personal plans. But this time, I frankly said I couldn't help and briefly explained why. I thought she would be disappointed or angry. Instead, she was silent for a few seconds, then said, "I understand. Thank you for being direct." I was surprised to realize that sometimes others respect us more when we respect ourselves. Learning to please myself also forced me to address a difficult question. Ultimately, what do I want for my life? In the past, my answer almost always involved pleasing someone else's parents, partners, colleagues, friends. Now I had to listen to the voice I had once ignored. It was a voice not loud, but persistent. It reminded me of hobbies I once had, dreams I had postponed, things that made me feel alive but had been buried under years of chasing others' expectations. Walking alone in the park in the morning, writing a few lines in a journal every day, relearning a skill I had abandoned initially, these actions didn't elicit anyone else's interest or praise. But I noticed myself gradually feeling more complete, no longer dependent on external validation. I understood that if I wanted to please the only person who truly matters myself, I had to bravely face the unfamiliar, even frightening, feeling of no longer relying on others' approval. But the deeper I went, the more I realized this was the foundation of freedom. I realized that pleasing myself isn't a destination but a skill. And this skill needs daily practice, like training muscles. Every day I have to choose, will I live according to the old trajectory, safe in the eyes of others but distant from myself? Or will I step into unfamiliar territory, where I place my own needs and values on equal footing with everyone else's? Some days this is harder than I imagine. Sometimes just a gentle remark from someone is enough to pull me back into my old role, the role of someone who always nods, always tries not to bother. I have to learn to stop, take a deep breath, and ask, am I doing this because I want to, or because I'm afraid? That question acts like a flashlight, illuminating the dark corners of my choices. The strange thing is, when I started living more truthfully with myself, the relationships around me also changed. Some people were no longer as close to me as before. They were used to a pliable, accommodating me, and when I was no longer that way, they left. Initially, this hurt, but then I understood that their departure wasn't a loss, but a purification. Those who stayed were the ones who truly valued me, both my bright sides and my darker corners. I also realized that when I stopped expecting everyone to like me, I had more opportunities for deeper connections. Previously, my kindness was like a glossy coat of paint, beautiful but slippery. Now I allowed myself to have rougher surfaces, and it was in those imperfect spots that true intimacy could take hold. Pleasing myself also meant I had to take full responsibility for my emotions. I couldn't continue to blame others for my fatigue or disappointment if I myself had put myself in that situation. This was a hard pill to swallow but liberating, because when I took responsibility, I also gained the power to change. Once, I declined to participate in a project that I would have definitely taken on before. The reason was simple. I knew it would consume time and energy that I wanted to dedicate to another goal. Of course, my refusal displeased a few people. But when I sat down one morning, sipping coffee and working on the task I had chosen, I clearly saw one thing. This piece was the reward for that decision. Looking back, I see that learning to please myself wasn't just about escaping an old way of life, but about building a new map. A map where I was the center, not the approval of others. And the most wonderful thing is that when I truly live authentically, I not only please myself, but also bring the world the most genuine, powerful version of myself. It took me many years to understand this seemingly simple truth. The only person I need to live with my entire life is myself. If I cannot please that person, all efforts to please anyone else will only be temporary. Chapter 4. Prioritizing your own needs. Prioritizing my own needs is selfish. My whole life, I was taught to care for others first, to anticipate what they needed and do it, even when I didn't want to. But the more I lived that way, the more exhausted I became. I was like a water pitcher constantly pouring for others, but never refilled for myself. We often neglect our needs, hoping others will automatically notice and meet them. But the reality is, if we ourselves don't pay attention to or value them, who will? And even if someone tries, they can only guess. When they guess wrong, we become disappointed and resentful, while never having told them what we truly needed. Prioritizing your own needs doesn't mean becoming insensitive or cold towards others. It simply means I consider myself as important as anyone else in my life. And only when I am healthy and fulfilled can I genuinely offer care, not out of obligation or weariness. This lesson didn't come from a flash of insight, but from times when life itself pushed me to the wall. I remember one day my schedule was packed with appointments and helping others. When I got home, I was too tired to eat dinner, my head was aching, and all I wanted to do was lie down. But the phone rang. A friend wanted me to listen to their troubles, as usual. I tried to rouse myself, but this time my body refused. I couldn't utter another word. In that silence, I realized I had reached my limit long ago. I just had never allowed myself to stop. Instead of automatically saying, yes, I first ask myself, do I have enough energy and desire to do this? If the answer is no, I practice saying no, gently but firmly. And surprisingly, the world continues to function. Everyone manages just fine without me having to save them all the time. I also discovered that taking care of myself doesn't diminish my value in the eyes of those who truly appreciate me. On the contrary, they begin to respect my time and boundaries more. As for those who only seek me out when they need something, never reciprocating the concern, they gradually disappear. Part of prioritizing yourself is being honest with yourself about your true needs, not just the reasonable ones that others might accept. Sometimes that need is a full day to myself, no schedule, no responsibilities. Sometimes it's a midweek nap or a solo trip. When I started living this way, I keenly felt one thing. My needs are not a luxury, but the fuel for my existence. And if I continue to sacrifice that fuel, sooner or later, the vehicle of my life will break down mid-journey. When I constantly neglect my needs to prioritize others, I am not truly as kind as I think. What I give in those moments is often mixed with silent resentment, a feeling of being exploited, and even sacrifice made for recognition. These things, sooner or later, will manifest in my eyes, voice, or attitude. The recipient may not say it, but they sense it. And I am stuck in a loop of wanting to be liked while feeling disrespected. Prioritizing my own needs forces me to relearn a lost skill, listening to myself. Not the superficial listening like, I'm hungry, or I'm tired, but a deep listening to recognize when my mind is overloaded, when my heart needs space, when my body is screaming from neglect. At first, it felt alien, as if I was talking to someone I hadn't met in a long time. But gradually, that strangeness disappeared, replaced by a new familiarity, the feeling that I and my true self are allies. I also had to confront another truth. Many of my needs will never be prioritized by others if I don't do it first. Not because they are malicious or insensitive, but simply because everyone is caught up in their own needs and problems. Expecting others to automatically care about me when I never speak up is like expecting someone to invite me to dinner when I've never said I'm hungry. Therefore, I began to practice clearly stating what I needed. For the first time, I asked for a day off just to recover energy instead of finding excuses or pretending to be busy. For the first time, I told a friend that I wanted a quiet get-together instead of a noisy bar. And for the first time, I told a family member that I couldn't help them at that moment because I needed to focus on my own problems. To my surprise, the reactions I received were not as bad as I had imagined. Many even thanked me for being honest. Some were initially startled but then understood. Some others drifted away, and I learned to accept that. Because if a relationship only exists when I constantly ignore my own needs, then that relationship was never fair. When prioritizing myself, I also discovered the power of empty spaces in my schedule. Previously, my calendar was like a crowded tapestry with no blank spots. Every minute was filled with tasks, responsibilities, or others' needs. Now, I deliberately leave gaps. This is time I use to rest, create, or simply do nothing. And it is precisely these gaps that become a source of energy, helping me do everything else better. More importantly, prioritizing my own needs has gradually changed how I perceive my self-worth. I no longer measure it by the number of times I please others, but by what percentage of myself I live truthfully. And this new metric, though sometimes harsh, brings me a freedom I never knew before. Prioritizing my needs is not just an act of self-care. It's a declaration to the world. I have value, and that value does not depend on whom I serve or how many people I please. It is an affirmation that my existence deserves to be protected and my needs deserve to be heard. A longtime friend messaged me, asking for help moving over the weekend. Previously, I would have nodded immediately, even if my schedule was packed. But this time I replied, "This weekend I'm taking time for myself, so I can't help. If you need, I can recommend a good moving service." I waited for disappointment or blame, but instead my friend just said, "Thanks, I understand." That reply was as light as a breeze. And I realized that most of the negative scenarios I had imagined only existed in my head. Since putting my needs first, I've noticed another clear change. I rarely fall into a state of simmering anger. Before, I often carried small resentments not big enough to erupt, but enough to make me tired and bitter. Now, when I am honest with myself and with others, those angers dissipate. I no longer have to live in a state of serving others while feeling exploited. Of course, this doesn't turn me into a selfish person who only thinks of himself. It makes me more genuine. When I choose to help someone, it's because I truly want to, not because of a feeling of obligation or fear of rejection. And when help comes from a genuine desire, it becomes lighter, warmer, and more complete. To maintain the prioritization of my needs, I needed to establish clear boundaries. Boundaries are not walls to push others away, but markers for both me and them to know the safe limits for everyone. Initially, setting boundaries made me feel guilty, as if I was breaking an unwritten rule that I must always be available. But gradually, I noticed that these very boundaries helped my relationships become healthier. Today, if someone asks me what has changed most since I started prioritizing myself, I would say it's the feeling of living authentically. I no longer lose myself in the endless expectations of others. I no longer measure my worth by what I can do for someone else. And I know that no matter how noisy and demanding the outside world is, I can always return to a quiet place within where my needs are heard and respected. First and foremost, I understand that prioritizing my needs not only changes how I live, but also changes the quality of what I give. Because only when I am full can I give completely, not from scarcity, but from true abundance. Asterisk Chapter 5, Reclaiming Personal Power. Personal power is not something someone grants us, nor is it a gift we can beg for. It inherently lies within us, but we easily surrender it to others with our own hands. Sometimes we do it in exchange for a feeling of security, sometimes to maintain harmony, sometimes simply because we don't know how to keep it for ourselves. And then we live like tenants in our own home, always wary of every step, always waiting for someone's permission. I used to be like that. My power was scattered, leaking into casual, yes, nods, into promises I didn't want to keep, into situations where I let others decide for me. Each time I felt myself shrink, as if I was curling into a corner to fit the image others wanted me to be. But personal power doesn't disappear just because we neglect it. It's still there, waiting for us to dare to reach out and reclaim it. And to do that, I first had to recognize the moments I gave it away. I started noticing the times I reluctantly agreed, the times I didn't speak the truth for fear of causing discomfort, the times I avoided conflict by pretending to have no opinion. Each of those signs was a leak of power, and only when I looked directly at it did I know where to plug it. Reclaiming personal power is not about becoming a tyrant. It's about returning to the center of your own life, knowing that your voice and your choices carry weight. I remember the first time I dared to push back against a request I didn't want to fulfill. It was a meeting. A colleague tried to hand me a task he didn't want to do. In the past, I would smile and accept it, even if I felt annoyed inside. But that day, I said, I can't take on this additional work because I'm currently focused on completing my own tasks. No long explanations, no excuses, just a simple sentence, but it was like standing up straight after years of bowing my head. Interestingly, the world didn't collapse after that statement. No one yelled at me, no one fired me. On the contrary, some colleagues began to look at me differently, no longer as someone willing to shoulder everything, but as someone who knew how to hold his ground. I realized that sometimes it's fear itself that inflates the consequences of reclaiming power. I set myself an exercise. Every day, I would do one small thing that demonstrated I was in control of my life. Some days I would decline a meeting I found pointless. Some days I would choose to voice an unpopular opinion within the group. Some days I would simply decide to dedicate the evening to myself, despite a few people expressing dissatisfaction. Each small action like this accumulated. And I felt my body change. My shoulders became less hunched, my gaze more direct, my voice deeper and clearer. But reclaiming personal power isn't just about saying, no. It's also about taking responsibility for my own life. When I blame others for what happens to me, I'm also giving my power to them. Only when I acknowledge that every choice, including the choice to remain silent or the choice to endure, is mine, do I truly regain control. This is both liberating and terrifying because it forces me to look at the parts I want to avoid. Reclaiming personal power is not a one-day event but a continuous process where every moment can become a test. I started recognizing situations where I would have previously reacted with my old people-pleasing habit. But now I could stop, take a breath, and ask myself, is this truly what I want? That simple question has many times saved me from putting myself in unbalanced situations. One evening, a friend invited me to a late dinner. Previously, I would have agreed immediately, even knowing I had to wake up early the next morning. This time, I said, tonight I need to rest, maybe another time. In the silence after that statement, I clearly felt the weight of the choice. Personal power often lies in such small things, not dramatic confrontations, but moments when we assert our right to prioritize our health, time, and peace. When I started reclaiming my power, some people reacted negatively. Not everyone is happy to see us no longer as compliant as before. Some will test our boundaries, some will show disappointment, even anger. And I understand that's a good sign. It shows that the old structure is shaking. Holding on to your power doesn't mean winning every argument, but being firm with the boundaries you've set, even if it displeases others. I began to practice saying no without needing an apology. Initially, I often felt I had to explain to prove that my reasons were valid enough. But then I realized that inadvertently placed others in the position of judge, while I stood in the position of being judged. Personal power means I can refuse simply because I want to, and that's enough. To nurture that power, I learned to listen to my inner voice. Whenever faced with a decision, I tried to observe the sensation in my body. If my chest felt heavy, my shoulders stiff, my throat dry, that was often a sign I was about to say yes when I wanted to say no. Conversely, when I felt light, my breath deep and steady, that was usually when I was choosing what was right for me. Another important part of reclaiming personal power is ending the blame game. I used to believe I lost power because others were too demanding, too controlling, or too selfish. But the truth is, I let them do that. This was hard to swallow because it placed the responsibility squarely on my shoulders. Yet, the moment I acknowledged that, I felt like an old door closed and another opened a place where I no longer had to wait for anyone to grant me permission. Personal power is not something to flaunt. It's an inner state of stillness where I know I can stand firm no matter how circumstances change. It gives me the feeling that I am the captain of my own ship, no matter how high the waves rise. And strangely, the more I grasped my own helm, the less I felt the need to control others. As personal power began to flow back into my veins, I distinctly felt a change in how I presented myself to the world. My voice trembled less when speaking in a crowd. I looked directly into people's eyes without trying to guess what they thought of me. I walked with the sense that I didn't need permission to exist. But at the same time, a new challenge emerged, keeping this power without turning it into a wall. I understood that if I let the fear of being hurt lead me, I could easily turn firmness into rigidity, boundaries into isolating fortresses. True personal power is the ability to choose to open or close, not to lock myself away permanently. An old acquaintance came to me, asking for urgent help with something. Previously, I would have immediately agreed, then struggled in exhaustion and resentment. This time, I listened carefully to their story, considering if I could help without losing my own balance. Finally, I agreed to help, but set clear limits on time and method. The result was that both of us were satisfied. They received help, and I didn't feel exploited or neglected myself. Personal power also requires me to be thoroughly honest with others, but first and foremost, honest with myself. This is sometimes uncomfortable because it forces me to confront the darker parts, the less than noble motives that I used to pretend didn't exist. I realized that every time I said yes to be liked or remained silent to maintain an image, I was placing my worth in the hands of others. And this truth, though bitter, liberated me. Gradually, I saw that personal power lies not only in protecting myself from external pressure, but also in the ability not to be dragged down by inner voices' self-criticism, memories of failure, negative predictions. All of these could strip away my power if I believed them. But when I learned to see them as passing clouds, not identifying with them as my true self, I found myself standing firmer. I began to believe that personal power is not a destination, but a way of living. It's not about always winning, but about the ability to maintain one's identity even when losing. It doesn't require me to be invincible, but only demands that I don't hand over the keys to my life to anyone else. And every day I maintain that, even in a small choice, is every day I reassert my sovereignty. Looking back, I realized that the journey of reclaiming personal power was not a noisy revolution, but a series of silent yet consistent decisions. Each no, spoken at the right time, each boundary held firm, each moment I chose to stand by myself, all these accumulated into a new strength. And now, as I walk, I know clearly that I am no longer a guest in my own life. I am the homeowner, and I will never leave this position again. Chapter 6, Reclaiming Your Manhood. I once lived in a world where the concept of manhood was twisted into a distorted mess. From a young age, I heard conflicting messages. On one hand, society said men must be strong, decisive, not weak. On the other hand, I was encouraged to be gentle, sensitive, and avoid all conflict. The result was that I grew up as a diluted version, not quite fitting any mold, always trying to guess what others wanted from me and adjusting myself to please them. This made me a nice guy, always striving to be polite, kind, avoid confrontation, and willing to compromise to the point of losing myself. I thought this approach would make me loved and accepted, but the truth was, the more I tried to be seen as appropriate, the more I felt taken for granted, even overlooked. A man is not someone who only demands, dictates, or uses strength to dominate. But a man is also not someone who strips himself of his power to become harmless. I realized both extremes are unhealthy. Reclaiming manhood means finding balance, a form of strength that doesn't need to be loud, a presence that by simply being there creates an impact. Back then, I often avoided situations that required me to express my opinion or defend my boundaries. If someone cut in front of me, took my share, or showed disrespect, I would offer a fake smile and pretend it was fine. But inside, I seethed with anger, not at them, but at myself for not daring to stand up. This feeling, over time, gnawed at my self-esteem and made me feel smaller. The process of reclaiming manhood began when I dared to admit that I had lost it. I had let the fear of rejection, judgment, and isolation control my behavior. I had sacrificed my strength for temporary acceptance, and to get it back, I had to start with small but decisive steps. I remember the first time I dared to say directly, "I disagree," in a meeting. My heart pounded, my throat was dry, but I still spoke. The initial reaction was a surprised silence from everyone, but then something miraculous happened. They listened. Some disagreed, but no one tore me apart as the fear in my head had imagined. That day, I realized that masculine strength lies not in avoiding all conflict, but in the ability to confront and handle it without losing composure. Reclaiming manhood is not about learning to be aggressive or dominant, but about learning to stand firm even when others disagree. It's the ability to remain oneself in high-pressure situations, neither shrinking nor exploding. It's allowing oneself to express resolve and strength naturally, without apology, without justification. To truly be a man, I had to reconnect with the primal part within me, the powerful energy that is eager to explore, welcomes challenges, and isn't afraid of risks. Modern society often makes us forget this part, instead stuffing us with standards of safety, convention, and predictability. But it is precisely that wildness that gives us the feeling of truly living. I began to rediscover that primal part through experiences I previously avoided. It could be a winter climb, where my breath turned to smoke and each step had to fight against the biting cold wind. It could also be martial arts training sessions, where I was thrown to the mat, feeling the pain spread through my body, but also feeling my strength and flexibility more clearly. These experiences not only challenged me physically, but also forged my will, forcing me to confront fear and discomfort and then overcome them. Manhood is not something I need to create from scratch. It's something that was already within me, just covered in dust from years of living in fear and self-doubt. Every time I step into a situation that requires me to commit, whether it's defending my viewpoint, initiating a difficult conversation, or accepting a new challenge, I feel like I'm dusting off those layers, revealing the steel core within. However, this process also forced me to look directly at the wounds that had once made me withdraw. Most of those wounds stem from childhood, when I learned to be good to avoid criticism or punishment. I once thought that keeping silent and not causing trouble was the only way to be safe. But now I understand that it was that very silence that caused me to lose my voice. And once the voice is lost, strength follows suit and disappears. To reclaim my voice, I started focusing on speaking my truth, even when it was uncomfortable for others. I learned to say no without feeling guilty, to express desires without fear of being judged as selfish. I realized that this honesty didn't alienate me. On the contrary, it made me more trustworthy. Others knew that when I agreed, it was genuine, not a false accommodation. Another thing I learned is that manhood is not only measured by what we do, but also by how we face failure. In the past, every time I stumbled, I would torment myself with harsh self-reproach, then withdraw, avoiding all new risks. But when I changed my perspective, seeing failure as an essential part of growth, I started daring to try more, and the more I tried, the stronger I became. Not because I always won, but because I knew I could get back up after every loss. Manhood is also linked to the ability to protect not just others, but oneself. It's the ability to recognize when your boundaries are being crossed and to firmly stop it. I remember once a colleague tried to push their work onto me, saying, "You do it better." In the past, I would have forced a smile and agreed. This time, I frankly said that I already had too much work and they needed to handle their own part. Initially, they seemed displeased, but later they actually respected me more. Each time I held my ground, I felt the masculine energy within me more clearly, not loud, not ostentatious, but steadfast. It's like a mountain. It doesn't need to move to prove its strength, it just needs to exist firmly amidst all changes. To reclaim manhood, I also had to learn to connect with other men. For many years, I avoided male groups, partly out of fear of comparison, partly because I thought I wasn't good enough to belong. But when I started participating in male-only spaces where we shared stories, challenged each other, and sometimes just sat in silence together, I realized how much I had been missing this. In those moments, I felt a kind of collective strength, an unspoken recognition. There, I didn't have to try hard to prove anything. I just needed to be myself, and being fully myself was enough. The presence of other men was like a mirror, reflecting back to me the strength I thought I had lost. Manhood cannot be separated from responsibility. It's not a reluctant responsibility or a burden, but a voluntary commitment to what one values: family, work, life values. When a man truly steps up to take responsibility, he is not only protecting what is important, but also asserting his place in this world. And then a subtle but profound change happened. When I lived with my manhood, those around me also began to change how they treated me. They listened more, respected me more, and rarely tried to cross my boundaries. The interesting thing is, I didn't need to act tough or threaten anyone. Simply by knowing who I am and not being afraid to show it, the world naturally adjusted to fit. However, living with manhood doesn't mean I am never soft. True strength lies in flexibility, knowing when to be firm, when to be gentle, when to advance, when to retreat. A man who is only rigid is easily broken, but a man who is both strong and gentle at the right times, that is a man who cannot be defeated. The journey of reclaiming manhood never truly ends. It's not a destination, but a way of living, a choice I have to make every day, every morning. When I wake up, I stand before the opportunity to choose: continue living as a shrunken version of myself out of fear, or live fully with the strength, confidence, and courage that inherently belong to me. And I choose strength, not strength to dominate others, but to stand firm amidst all challenges, protect what is important, and live a life where I no longer have to ask anyone for permission to be myself. Chapter 7, Getting the Love You Want. Successful Strategies for Intimate Relationships. When a man begins to step out of his nice guy shell, he often realizes that the biggest void is not in his work or achievements, but in his intimate relationships. I have witnessed countless nice guys speak about their romantic lives with a simmering disappointment. They give so much. They try their best to please, to avoid conflict, but what they often receive in return is distance, coldness, or worse, contempt. I understand that feeling because I lived it for many years. I thought that love meant doing everything to make the other person happy, even sacrificing my own needs. I thought that if I was kind enough, patient enough, tolerant enough, my partner would reciprocate with deep love. But reality was harsh. The more I tried to please, the more I lost my own attractiveness. To get the love I wanted, I had to relearn from scratch. Not how to win the game of love, but how to be present in a relationship as a complete man. This started with being honest with myself. What do I truly want from a relationship? What do I need to feel connected, respected? And what boundaries am I willing to set to protect that? Love doesn't come when we cling to it, but when we dare to let go of what no longer serves us. There were relationships I had to admit had died long ago, even if they maintained the outward form. Leaving them wasn't a betrayal, but a way to free both of us from an invisible cage. I also learned that attraction in love isn't just based on looks or sweetness, it lies in energy. The energy of someone who knows who they are, knows what they want, and isn't afraid to show it. A man like that doesn't need to chase love. Love is drawn to him like metal to a magnet. But to maintain a deep connection, courage alone isn't enough. It requires complete presence here and now. When you listen, when you touch, when you share. I used to sit next to the person I loved, but my mind would wander to work, my phone, or vague anxieties. And I realized that in those moments, I was absent. Love cannot last long if that absence becomes a habit. When I was with my partner, I focused all my attention on them, their eyes, their voice, every small gesture, without judgment, without distraction. The strange thing is that when I was truly present, the atmosphere between us changed. Conversations became deeper, touches became warmer, and differences were no longer threats but opportunities to understand each other better. Of course, true love doesn't mean everything is always smooth. There will be times of disagreement, times of hurt, times of prolonged silence. But instead of avoiding them or pretending nothing is wrong, I learned to confront them. I spoke up when I felt hurt and also listened when the other person needed to speak. Sometimes these conversations were so difficult that I wanted to leave, but I knew that if we got through them, the relationship would be stronger. The love I wanted wasn't a love based on dependence or fear of loss. It was love between two free individuals, each with their own life, passions, and strength, but choosing to step into each other's world. It's a love that doesn't suffocate, doesn't control, but also doesn't loosen its grip to the point of indifference. And most importantly, I realized that to get the love I wanted, I first had to be the man I also wanted to love. To become the man I also wanted to love, I had to look directly at the habits that had previously destroyed relationships. I realized that most of them stemmed from fear. Fear of rejection, fear of not being good enough, fear of losing love once obtained. This fear made me act like a bargainer, giving a lot in the hope of receiving reassurance. But love is not a contract, and a partner is not a judge to certify my worth. When I was still seeking validation from my partner, I gave them too much power to dictate my mood, my confidence, and even the direction of my life. Each time they didn't respond as desired, I plunged into confusion and anger, even if outwardly I appeared calm. I began to change by separating love from the need for recognition. I learned to validate myself through the things I did, through the principles I upheld, through the moments I chose the harder path because it was the right thing to do. When my self-esteem no longer depended on others' praise or attention, I felt freer. This freedom helped me be less controlling in relationships. Previously, I often tried to shape my partner's emotions, avoided upsetting them, found every way to make them happy, and unconsciously sought reassurance. Now, I give my partner space to be themselves, even if that means they are not always in the state I desire. When I stopped trying to control, love became deeper and more authentic. Because then the other person no longer had to play the role I wanted, and I no longer had to play the role of the perfect man to keep them. We met where both of us could be ourselves, with all our strengths, weaknesses, vulnerabilities, and desires. Another important lesson was learning to say no in love. Previously, I feared that refusing would hurt the other person or make them leave, so I usually accepted every request, even if it exhausted me or went against my values. But a healthy relationship needs clear boundaries, and each time I courageously said, no to unconditional sacrifice, no to ignoring true feelings, I saw the respect between us grow. At the same time, I learned to accept no from my partner without seeing it as a personal rejection. It was simply a boundary, a separate need. Understanding this helped me be less defensive, less overly reactive, and instead curious to understand what lay behind that no. In this process, I also discovered the power of directly expressing needs. Previously, I often expected my partner to read my mind that if they loved me, they would know what I wanted, what I needed, and proactively meet those needs. When that didn't happen, I felt abandoned or unappreciated. Now I understand that expressing my needs doesn't make me weak or dependent. On the contrary, it's an act of taking responsibility for my own happiness. Stating needs is also a way to give my partner the opportunity to offer their love willingly, instead of being forced to guess. This not only reduces misunderstandings, but also creates a clear and sincere flow of exchange where both feel seen, heard, and understood. The more I practiced, the more I realized that the love I wanted wasn't a love without conflict, but a love strong enough to withstand conflict and grow from it. It's a love built on a foundation of mutual respect, honest communication, and the freedom for each person to continue growing without losing the connection. To get the love I desired, I had to be willing to become the man who could create and sustain that love. This didn't come from a few fleeting romantic gestures, but from how I lived every day. How I reacted when stressed, how I dealt with being hurt, and how I faced moments when things didn't go my way. All those small moments combined are the material that nurtures or weakens a relationship. A crucial turning point was when I stopped viewing love as a reward to be earned and started seeing it as a flow that needed continuous care. Like a garden, if neglected, it will be full of weeds. But if watered daily, weeded, and patiently waited upon, it will blossom. Love is not just an emotion. It's a series of consistent choices and actions, even when the initial feelings have faded. In the past, I wanted love to always be at its peak, the flame of passion never dying. But I realized that was an illusion. Lasting love doesn't always burn brightly. Sometimes it's just a simmering warmth, enough for both to feel secure and safe. And it is in these peaceful moments that a deep bond has the opportunity to form. I also learned to look at the true nature of intimacy, not just physical attraction, but the ability to be fully present when together. When I truly listened, not rushing to respond, not letting my mind wander elsewhere, the other person felt that they mattered. That presence is a priceless gift, a kind of love language that needs no words. On the other hand, I had to face the truth that not everyone is ready or suitable to build this kind of love with me. That doesn't mean they are bad or I failed. It simply means we don't share the same rhythm, values, or vision. When I realized that, I let go without resentment. Because I understood that holding onto an unsuitable relationship just out of fear of loneliness would hurt both of us. And then, what I once thought was a paradox became the key. When I stopped trying to find love in every corner and instead focused on becoming a complete, life-loving, and free person, love began to find me naturally. It was no longer a chase but a meeting of two currents. Each current was already full. And because of that, when combined, they created a larger, deeper river. The love I wanted wasn't in a specific person, but in how I chose to live and connect. If I maintained honesty, respect, and the courage to be truly present, love, in its true sense, would always be there. Asterisk Chapter 8, Getting the Sex Life You Want, Successful Strategies for a Fulfilling Intimate Life. Sex is a natural part of a relationship. If you love each other enough, it will happen regularly, passionately, and satisfyingly. But then I realized that sex doesn't operate on autopilot. It needs to be nurtured, explored, and sometimes completely reinvented. By neglecting this, I witnessed the physical connection in many of my relationships gradually fade, leaving a silent yet dangerous distance. When I was a nice guy, in the old way, I treated sex like a reward, something I would be given if I was kind enough, caring enough, and accommodating enough. The problem with that approach was it turned me into a passive receiver, always waiting and hoping. Instead of proactively creating intimate moments, it also placed the woman in complete control, and that inadvertently killed the attraction between us. As I began to change, I had to confront an unpleasant truth. I had never truly learned how to communicate about sex. I avoided talking about it for fear of being judged, of making my partner uncomfortable, or of being rejected. But silence creates space for misunderstanding and false assumptions. We often guessed each other's intentions, and when we guessed wrong, both of us were disappointed. I started by breaking down the taboo surrounding talking about needs and desires. This didn't happen overnight. It required courage to express myself frankly but not assertively. I learned to talk about what I liked, what I was curious to try, and to ask how my partner felt about those things. The interesting thing is that when I opened up, they also started sharing more. There were things they had wanted for a long time, but had never said because they thought I wouldn't be comfortable or would judge. It turned out that just one person breaking the ice completely changed the atmosphere between us. From shyness, sex became a shared journey of discovery, where both felt safe to experiment and reveal themselves. One of the most effective strategies I learned was separating sex from the pressure of achieving an endpoint. Previously, my partner and I often unconsciously aimed for orgasm, and when it didn't happen, both of us felt like failures. But when I focused on the process, on the sensation of each touch, each breath, each glance, everything became lighter and more captivating. Sometimes, the times we didn't reach the finish line were the most intimate experiences. Attraction doesn't begin in the bedroom. It's nurtured by moments outside of it. The way I lightly touched their back as I walked past, the way I looked into their eyes when I smiled, or the way I truly listened when they told a story. These small signals accumulate, creating an undercurrent of electricity waiting to erupt when we are together privately. Another big change came from learning to retain sexual energy instead of letting it be eroded by stress, work, or unconscious habits. Previously, I often poured all my energy into pleasing everyone, only to come home an empty shell, exhausted and disconnected from myself. Sex in those days felt more like a chore to be completed than an experience to be enjoyed. When I started prioritizing self-care, everything else changed too. I got enough sleep, exercised, ate better, and importantly, allowed myself to relax, play, and create. These things not only improved my physical health, but also rekindled a vitality that naturally made me more attractive to others. Sexual energy, I realized, is life energy. If I know how to nurture it, it will radiate into every aspect of my life. I also learned to create context for intimacy, not just planned evenings, but unexpected moments like sending a suggestive text message during the day or whispering something tantalizing in their ear at a party. When space and time are skillfully arranged, it's like kindling ready to ignite, and I discovered that proactivity has its own allure. Previously, I often waited for signals from my partner to initiate, fearing that if I was proactive, they would refuse or feel pressured. But when I approached with confidence and respect, without rushing, without demanding, they usually responded with excitement. Being proactive is not about imposition. It's an inviting allure that shows I desire and appreciate them. What makes sex truly rich is when it's not confined to patterns. My partner and I tried different ways of touching, different rhythms, even different spaces. Sometimes it was intense passion, sometimes it was gentle, prolonged intimacy for hours. This variety kept the relationship fresh and gave us both opportunities to explore emotional depths never before touched. But above all, I understood that quality sex cannot exist without a foundation of trust and respect. When a partner knows they are safe, that I will listen, that I will respect their boundaries, they can let go of all their defenses. And in that surrender, a primal, deep, and pure connection emerges. Once, a woman and I shared an evening that both of us will always remember. Not because of perfect technique or absolute physical satisfaction, but because we touched a place within each other that we had never reached before. A glance, a handhold, a breath in sync, and all barriers disappeared. It was as if we were not just together, but merging into one. I began to realize that if I wanted a truly fulfilling sex life, I had to break free from the deeply ingrained, taking mindset. Previously, I thought sex was a form of exchange. I do something good, they will reciprocate with their body. That way of thinking turned intimacy into a transaction, and nothing kills passion faster than that. When I let go of that mindset, sex became a shared dance where neither of us was keeping score, but simply enjoying each rhythm. A significant part of the change was learning to receive pleasure instead of just focusing on giving it. Many men like me once believed that we had to be the leaders, had to make the woman orgasm to prove our prowess. That pressure not only stressed me out but also skewed the connection. When I allowed myself to relax, receive affection, and enjoy the sensations they brought, a strange thing happened. They also felt freer, and our harmony multiplied. I also learned not to shy away from awkward moments. Sometimes a new idea didn't work out, or a clumsy movement made us both burst into laughter. Previously, I would have felt embarrassed, thinking I had ruined everything. Now I understand that those very moments create true intimacy, where no one has to play a perfect role and both can truly be themselves. Another element I had to practice was maintaining eye contact. It sounds simple, but eye contact in sex is not just an expression of desire, it's a window to authenticity. When I looked deeply into my partner's eyes during intimate moments, there was a flow of communication that transcended all words. It was both raw and sacred, both demanding courage and providing a sense of security. I noticed that sex is not just about the physical, it's a form of language, and like any language, it needs practice, creativity, and listening. Each person has their own vocabulary, gestures, rhythms, subtle touches that make them tremble. When I took the effort to learn that language, I was not only making love to their body, but also touching their soul. The most important thing I want to hold on to is curiosity. Not curiosity to conquer more, but curiosity to explore deeper what is already there. Each intimate moment is not just repeating the old, but opening a new door. Sometimes that door leads to pleasure, sometimes to a deep conversation, and sometimes simply to holding each other in silence. Sex, I understand, is an endless journey. And when I enter it with an open heart, without pressure, without rigid expectations, I not only get the sex life I want. I get a rare connection where both leave the bed feeling seen, understood, and loved in a way no words can describe. Chapter 9, Living the Life You Want, Discovering Passion and Purpose in Life, Work, and Career. The desired life is a vague concept, only for the lucky or those with special circumstances. I believed I just needed to live well in my current situation, work hard, and the remaining pieces would naturally fall into place. But over time, I realized that this passivity only distanced me from myself. If I didn't proactively seek and nurture my passions, if I didn't clearly define what made me feel fully alive, then life would be filled with trivialities. Jobs to make a living, relationships to fill voids, habits just to forget emptiness. If I wasn't limited by money, time, or judgment, how would I choose to live? That question stirred up the dust covering old dreams. I remembered teenage afternoons, sitting for hours drawing, forgetting to eat. I remembered moments playing music until I forgot to sleep, just to hear the melodies I created. I remembered the feeling of my heart pounding when standing before an audience, telling my story, and seeing the listener's eyes light up. Those were the fragments of passion, something I had neglected in exchange for the stability that society deemed necessary. The problem is, passion doesn't just appear when you name it. It needs to be nurtured through commitment, time, and persistence. I once met people who believed that once they found their passion, everything would go smoothly. But they forgot that passion isn't a gift from heaven, it's a relationship. And like any relationship, it needs cultivation. If you don't dedicate time, if you don't accept challenges, passion will wither like a fire starved of oxygen. Sometimes what we are passionate about doesn't align with what we are good at. And what we are good at isn't what makes us happy long-term. Therefore, living the life you want requires the courage to try, to fail, and to learn how to piece these fragments into a harmonious picture. For me, it was the process of learning to turn passion into skill and skill into value, not just for myself but for others. One of the big turning points was when I stopped asking, "What do I want to do to make a living?" and started asking, "What do I want to contribute to this world?" This new question forced me to look beyond my ego, beyond personal satisfaction. It made me realize that purpose isn't just the joy of doing something you love, but the urge to create something meaningful, even if just for one person. And when purpose and passion intersect, that is the most fertile ground for planting a life worth living. The pursuit of passion can make one feel insecure, can make me lose what I've built. But then I realized nothing is more dangerous than living a meaningless life. The price of safety is sometimes a suffocated soul, and the price of commitment is sometimes losing superficial things in exchange for more lasting ones: freedom, joy, and the feeling of truly living. Once I embraced the journey of finding passion and purpose, I discovered something interesting. The world started responding in a completely different way. New opportunities appeared from places I never expected. Casual conversations led to collaboration offers, new relationships. Not because I was luckier, but because I changed how I presented myself to the world. I spoke with brighter eyes, I asked deeper questions, and I listened with genuine curiosity. Others sensed that, and they were drawn in. Once, sitting in a small coffee shop, I was diligently writing down ideas for a new project. A man at a nearby table, happening to glance over, asked what I was writing. We started talking. And it turned out he had gone through the very crisis I was describing. He not only shared his experience, but also introduced me to people who could help turn my idea into reality. Simply because I was living and breathing with a clear purpose, everything around me started connecting into an invisible network of support. But not every day is filled with inspiration and opportunity. There are mornings I wake up feeling doubtful about myself. I ask myself if I'm chasing an illusion, if I'm wasting time on things that don't bring real value, as people often say. And each time, I have to remind myself that real value is not just about money. Value also lies in clarity, in the belief that every day I am moving closer to a life worth living. To sustain that belief, I had to learn to balance dreaming and action. Dreaming gives me direction, action gives me foundation. I set small, measurable goals but always connected to a larger vision. Each time I completed a small goal, I felt stronger, more confident to move forward. And I also learned to celebrate those small victories because they are fuel to keep going. A significant part of this journey is knowing when to let go. Letting go of projects that no longer reflect who I am, letting go of relationships that only exist out of habit or convenience, letting go of old dreams I clung to just out of fear of emptiness. Each time I let go, I felt lighter, as if making more space for new things to enter. And strangely, When you dare to let go of less, you receive more. Friend asked me, "How do you know if you found your true purpose?" I replied that for me, the clearest sign is the feeling of harmony between what I do and who I am. It's when my work, relationships, and free time all reflect the same core values. I know I'm on the right track. There's no longer a separation between life and work. Everything becomes a unified flow. And in that flow, I no longer just live to complete a to-do list, but live to fulfill a larger story, a story worth telling. In the process of finding passion and purpose, I gradually realized an important truth. Not everything needs to be clear immediately. Some days I only knew the next step, not the entire path. And that's perfectly fine. That very ambiguity forced me to pay more attention to the present, to the small signals I used to overlook. I began to cherish brief but meaningful conversations, moments of thoughtful silence, and even minor failures. Everything played a role in shaping me. Failure was no longer a blemish to hide, but a map marking dead ends, helping me choose new paths. I learned that feeling lost is sometimes a sign that I'm about to discover a direction I never considered. When living closer to passion and purpose, I also became more patient. Previously, I was often impatient, wanting everything to happen quickly, wanting to see immediate results. Now, I understand that profound changes need time to take root and blossom. Like planting a seed, you cannot make the tree grow faster by pulling at it. You can only care for the soil, water it, and wait for it to stretch. This patience doesn't come from resignation, but from a firm belief that I am nurturing something worthwhile. As the journey progressed, I also noticed changes in how I perceived success. I used to think success was achieving big goals, being recognized by others, or owning symbols of achievement. Now, success for me is living each day in a way that doesn't betray myself, doing work I believe in, alongside people I respect, and still having the energy to love and be loved. Success is no longer a distant destination somewhere ahead, but a feeling of contentment with every step. At one point, I realized that I was no longer searching for passion and purpose as something external. They had become a part of me, intertwined with every thought, every decision. I no longer asked if I was living the life I wanted, because the answer was already evident in how I woke up each morning. I had learned that purpose is not a distant lighthouse, but a simmering fire in my chest, illuminating every moment. And if there's one piece of advice I want to give to anyone standing at the starting line, it would be, don't wait until you're ready. Readiness will never come completely. Start right now with what you have, where you are. Each step will reveal another part of the path. Each choice will bring you closer to the person you were born to be. And then one day, you will realize that you didn't just find the life you wanted. You created it with your own hands. Thank you for your time and attention in accompanying me through this book's journey. You not only listened to the words, but also allowed the ideas, stories, and silent questions to permeate your thoughts. In this noisy and hurried world, such patience is not trivial. If what you just heard has made you pause for a moment to reflect or sparked an intention to try to change something in your life, I would love to know. Please leave a comment, not just to review the book, but to share your own experience. Because sometimes your story will be a mirror for someone else searching for a path. And if you have another book in mind that you believe deserves to be explored, please suggest it. Who knows? Our next journey might just begin from that very suggestion, where new pages open and new stories await to be told.